The key was cold, not the cold of morning or the cold of winter metal left too long in the dark. A different kind of cold, the cold of something that had not been touched in years, the cold of a thing that had been waiting. Norah stood in the gravel lot behind her father's house, what used to be her father's house, and turned the key over in her palm. It was small, unremarkable, the kind of key that could open almost anything and nothing, a key without context, without memory. She had found it in his nightstand drawer, the same drawer where he used to keep loose change and broken watch straps and the little spiral notebook he wrote grocery lists in, though he never followed them. The same drawer where he once kept a postcard from her, sent from a beach town in Oregon she'd passed through during a year when she was trying to disappear into somewhere beautiful. He had kept that postcard for 11 years. The ink had faded to nearly nothing, but the key had been underneath everything. Under the expired coupons and the dried-out pens and the instruction manual for a blood pressure cuff that had stopped working in 2008. The key had been pressed against the wood of the drawer bottom, hidden in plain sight, and she might have missed it entirely if she hadn't been looking for something else. She couldn't remember what she'd been looking for. Maybe nothing. Maybe just the shape of him, the smell of his hands on the things he touched. The house had already been emptied by then, mostly. The furniture went to an estate sale company that took 60% and smiled while they did it. The clothes went to a donation bin behind the Methodist church, except for the flannel shirts she kept in a trash bag in the back of her Honda. The tools from the garage, his good tools, the craftsman wrenches he'd had since before she was born, those went to Marcus. Marcus was her older brother. Marcus was the one who handled everything after the call came at 4:17 on a Tuesday morning in March. He made the arrangements. He signed the paperwork. He stood in the funeral home lobby in a suit that cost more than her rent and spoke to the director in low, efficient tones while Norah sat in a plastic chair near the water cooler, holding a foam cup she didn't remember taking. She was grateful for that, at first. The not having to decide anything. The not having to answer questions about caskets or flowers or what kind of music their father would have wanted. Their father had never talked about music. He had listened to the same classic rock station for 40 years, the one with the static that got worse when it rained, and he never once complained about it. That was the kind of man he was. He found a thing that worked, and he stayed with it until it stopped. Marcus found a thing that worked, and he figured out how to make it profitable. That wasn't cruelty. Marcus wasn't cruel. He was just efficient. He had learned somewhere along the way that emotions were expensive, that grief had no return on investment, that the fastest way through a thing was to treat it like a transaction. So when he said, "I'll take the savings account and the tools and the truck, you take the ambulance and the medical equipment and the house, we'll split the rest," he said it like he was dividing assets in a divorce, like there was a spreadsheet open behind his eyes. And Norah said, "Okay." She always said okay. The ambulance was worthless. That was the first thing the appraiser told her, standing in the same gravel lot, kicking one of the tires with the toe of a boot that cost more than the vehicle he was evaluating. "You've got maybe $400 in scrap metal here," he said. "Maybe, if you find someone willing to haul it." The ambulance was a 1992 4350. The paint had faded from white to something closer to the color of an old refrigerator. The word ambulance was still visible on the side, but just barely. The letters had been worn down by sun and salt and 28 years of rural Michigan winters until they looked less like words and more like the ghost of a warning. The red stripe down the center had cracked into 1,000 tiny roads, like a map of somewhere nobody wanted to go. The back doors opened with a sound like a wounded animal. Inside, the ambulance was exactly what she expected. A stretcher bolted to the floor, the vinyl torn in 3 places and patched with duct tape that had gone brittle and brown. Cabinets along the walls, their latches stiff with rust. A heart monitor mounted near the ceiling, its screen dark, its cables coiled like sleeping snakes. The smell of old blood and older disinfectant and something else underneath, something sweet and chemical and sad. The last time this ambulance had run, Norah was 23 years old. She was 23 years old, and she was sitting in the passenger seat while her father drove 73 miles per hour down a 2-lane county road with his lights on and his sirens silent because the patient in the back was a 6-year-old boy who had stopped breathing, and her father believed, truly believed, with the kind of faith that had nothing to do with religion, that silence was sometimes faster than sound. She remembered that night because of the way the dash lights reflected off her father's glasses. Because of the way his hands looked on the steering wheel, not shaking, never shaking, but tight. Because of the way he said, "Talk to him, Norah, keep him with us." And she had turned in her seat and reached through the small window into the back, and she had talked to that boy. She talked to him about nothing. About a dog she'd had when she was 6, about the taste of grape popsicles, about the way the stars looked from her bedroom window on nights when she couldn't sleep. She talked to him about all of it, every meaningless detail she could summon, because her father had taught her that a voice was a rope, that as long as you kept talking, the person on the other end knew they weren't alone, that silence was the thing that let them go. The boy lived. That was the thing about being a paramedic. Sometimes you got to keep them. Sometimes you didn't. And the ones you lost, you carried them with you, in your chest, in your hands, in the way you gripped the steering wheel on cold March mornings when the roads were wet and the sky was the color of bad news. Norah had carried them for 6 years, and then she stopped. The ambulance had been parked in the gravel lot for 11 years. Her father had kept it, even after he retired. Even after the county bought new rigs and the old E350 became a relic, a dinosaur, a thing that cost more to insure than it was worth. He kept it because he couldn't let it go. Because letting it go would have meant letting go of something else, something he didn't have words for, something he carried in the same place she carried the ones she lost. He would sit in the driver's seat sometimes, on afternoons when the sun was low and the light through the windshield was the color of old honey. He would sit there with his hands on the steering wheel, not driving anywhere, just remembering the feel of it, the way the engine shuddered at idle, the way the radio crackled with dispatch calls from towns he hadn't visited in years. Norah would watch him from the kitchen window, and she would feel something twist in her chest, something that wanted to go out there and sit beside him and say, "Tell me about the worst one. Tell me about the one that broke you." But she never did. Because that wasn't how they talked. Because her father had built himself out of silence and stubbornness, and the kind of love that showed up in actions, not words. He showed up. That was what he did. He showed up at 2 a.m. when the call came. He showed up at school plays and parent-teacher conferences, and the night she graduated from paramedic school, standing in the back of the auditorium with his arms crossed and his jaw tight, and she saw him wipe his eyes when she walked across the stage, and neither of them ever mentioned it. He showed up at the hospital after the crash. She didn't remember the crash. She remembered the moment before, the rain, the curve in the road, the headlights coming too fast from the wrong direction, and then nothing until she woke up in a room that smelled like antiseptic and her own failure. The other driver had been drunk. That was what the police report said. That was what the lawyers said. That was what everyone said, as if it made a difference, as if knowing whose fault it was could undo the damage to her spine or the numbness in her left hand or the way her knees shook when she stood for more than 20 minutes. She had been 29 years old. She had been a good paramedic, not great, not like her father, not the kind of paramedic who could walk into a room and make people believe, just by being there, that everything might be okay. But good, competent, steady. The kind of paramedic who remembered to bring blankets for the families, the kind who held old women's hands in the back of the rig and told them they were going to be fine, even when she wasn't sure. After the crash, she couldn't lift more than 40 pounds, couldn't kneel, couldn't run, couldn't do the things a paramedic needed to do, the physical things, the things that made the job possible. She tried to go back. She went through the physical therapy. She did the exercises. She showed up at the station and sat in the break room and tried to pretend she was the same person she'd been before. But the other paramedics looked at her differently. Not with pity. Worse. With uncertainty. With the quiet calculation of people trying to decide if they could trust her with their patients, with their calls, with the moments that mattered. She lasted 4 months, and then she packed her apartment into cardboard boxes and drove to Oregon, to the beach town with the postcard, to a life that didn't require lifting or kneeling or running, to a job at a bookstore that paid $11 an hour and asked nothing of her except that she show up and shelve the new releases and smile at customers who would never know that she had once talked a 6-year-old boy back from the edge of death. She stayed there for 8 years. 8 years of waking up to the sound of foghorns, 8 years of watching tourists take pictures of the ocean, 8 years of telling herself that this was enough, that this was peace, that this was the life she had chosen and not the life that had been chosen for her. She came back to Michigan because her father was dying, liver cancer, fast. The kind of fast that leaves you dizzy, that makes you check your phone every hour because you can't believe how much time has passed, how much time you've lost, how much time you thought you had and didn't. She drove 37 hours straight. She arrived at the hospital at 11:14 p.m., her eyes burning, her left hand numb from gripping the steering wheel, and her father was already unconscious. Had been unconscious for 2 days, had been waiting for her, the nurses said, but waiting in the way old men wait, with their eyes closed and their hands still and their breath so shallow you had to lean close to know they were still there. She sat beside him for 43 hours. She talked to him about nothing, about the dog she'd had when she was 6, about the taste of grape popsicles, about the way the stars looked from her bedroom window. She talked to him because she didn't know what else to do, because talking had always been her job, because her father had taught her that a voice was a rope and she needed him to hold on. He died on a Tuesday morning at 4:17 a.m., the same time he had woken up for 32 years. The same time he had walked out the door in his uniform, coffee in one hand, keys in the other, already running the scenarios in his head. The same time he had kissed her forehead when she was little, before school, before everything, when the world was simple and her father was invincible and the ambulance in the driveway was just a vehicle and not a monument to everything they'd both lost. The key in her palm was warm now, from her skin, from the heat of her hand. She walked to the back of the ambulance. The gravel crunched under her boots, the same boots she'd worn for 11 years, the ones with the worn soles and the broken laces she'd replaced 3 times. She climbed up into the patient compartment and the floor flexed beneath her weight. Not much, just enough to notice, just enough to feel wrong. The floor of an ambulance isn't supposed to flex. It's supposed to be solid, rigid. Built to hold a stretcher and a patient and 2 paramedics and 600 pounds of equipment without giving an inch. This floor gave. She knelt, slowly, carefully, her knees complaining in the familiar way, and ran her hand over the vinyl. It was cold, smooth in some places, rough in others, worn down by years of boots and wheels and the occasional spill of something that left a stain no amount of bleach could remove. And then her fingers found the edge. A seam, not the seam where the vinyl met the wall, that was visible, obvious, the kind of seam you'd expect. This was different. This was a seam in the floor itself, a hairline break that ran in a rectangle about 3 feet by 2, invisible unless you were looking for it, unless you were kneeling, unless you were pressing on the vinyl with your weight and feeling it give. She found the latch by accident. Her thumb slipped. That's all. She was trying to brace herself, trying to shift her weight to a more comfortable position, and her thumb caught on something under the edge of the vinyl. A small metal tab, almost flush with the floor, the kind of thing you'd never notice unless you were pressing on it from exactly the right angle. She pulled, the tab lifted, a hinge, a latch, a small, precise mechanism that had been installed by someone who knew what they were doing, someone who had measured twice, cut once, and built this thing to last. The floor panel opened. Underneath was darkness, not the darkness of a shadow, the darkness of a space that had never been meant to see light. A compartment, welded into the frame of the ambulance between the floor and the undercarriage. A hidden space, maybe 6 inches deep, lined with rubber to keep things from rattling. And inside the compartment were boxes, not cardboard, small metal boxes, the kind that hold important things, the kind that lock, the kind that are designed to survive a crash, a fire, a flood, anything the road could throw at them. There were 7 of them. Norah sat back on her heels. The light through the back doors was thin and gray, the color of late afternoon in March when the sun can't decide whether to commit to spring or retreat back to winter. Dust motes drifted through the air, catching the light, glowing for a moment before disappearing into shadow. She pulled out the first box. It was heavy, not with weight, with density. The kind of heavy that comes from being full. She turned it over in her hands. There was no lock on the outside, no latch, just a smooth metal surface and a small seam where the lid met the base. She opened it. Inside were letters, hundreds of them, folded into precise thirds, stacked in rows, organized by date, by name, by something else she couldn't immediately understand. The paper was cheap, the kind of paper you'd buy in bulk at a discount store, the kind that yellowed after a few years and grew brittle at the edges. But the handwriting was careful, deliberate. The handwriting of someone who had learned to write before keyboards existed, before texting, before the world decided that a thumb-typed sentence was as good as a letter. She pulled out the top letter. The date was September 14th, 1998. The name at the top was Cheryl. The first sentence said, "I don't know if you remember me, but you saved my husband's life on I-75, and I've thought about you every day for 3 years." Norah read the letter standing in the ambulance, her back against the cabinet, her knees pressed together to keep them from shaking. Cheryl's husband had had a heart attack on the highway. A massive one, the kind that kills most people before the ambulance even arrives. But her father had gotten there in 7 minutes, had run the code in the rain, kneeling on the asphalt, his uniform soaked through, his hands steady, had gotten the man's heart started again, had transported him to the hospital with his sirens screaming and his foot pressed to the floor. The man lived, went back to work, watched his daughters graduate from high school, held his first grandchild. And every year, on the anniversary of the heart attack, Cheryl wrote a letter to the paramedic who had knelt in the rain and refused to let her husband die. She wrote it for 9 years. Until she died, until her daughter kept writing. The letters were in the box, all of them, every single one. Norah opened the second box. More letters, different handwriting, different stories. A teenager who had been thrown from a car and had woken up in the hospital with no memory of the crash, but a clear memory of the paramedic's voice, calm, steady, telling her to keep breathing, keep fighting, keep holding on. A grandmother who had fallen in her kitchen and lain on the floor for 2 days before someone found her. Her father had been the one to break down the door, had been the one to lift her, gently, carefully, and carry her to the stretcher. Had been the one to hold her hand in the back of the rig and tell her she was safe now. A construction worker who had lost his arm in an accident on a job site. Her father had tied the tourniquet, had applied the pressure, had stayed with him in the trauma bay long after his shift ended, just sitting in a plastic chair, just being present, just reminding the man that he was still a person even though he was missing a piece of himself. The letters went back to 1987. The year her father started, the year he climbed into an ambulance for the first time, green and scared and 22 years old, and discovered that he was good at this, that he could walk into chaos and find calm, that he could look at the worst moments of people's lives and see not tragedy but opportunity, the chance to help, to hold, to heal. The letters kept coming, box after box, year after year, thousands of letters, thousands of lives touched, changed, saved. People who had written to say thank you, people who had written to say they were still here, people who had written to say that they had named their children after him, that they had thought of him at their weddings, that they had carried his voice with them through divorces and diagnoses and the quiet, unbearable weight of ordinary life. And he had kept them all, every single one, in a hidden compartment under the floor of an ambulance that was worth $400 in scrap metal. Norah found the journal at the bottom of the 6th box. It was small, leather-bound. The kind of journal you'd buy at an airport bookstore because you had a long flight and you wanted to feel like you were the kind of person who wrote things down. The pages were soft now, worn smooth by years of handling, the edges feathered and gray. The first page said, "Things I can't tell anyone else." The handwriting was her father's. She knew it immediately. The way he made his T's, the way he crossed his F's, the way he dotted his I's with a small, almost invisible circle. She had seen that handwriting on grocery lists and birthday cards, and the sticky note he had left on the bathroom mirror the morning she left for paramedic school. "You're going to be better than me. I already know it." She sat down on the stretcher. The vinyl crackled under her weight. The torn places tugged at her jeans. She began to read. March 12, 1987. First day on the rig. Jerry told me I'd see things I couldn't unsee. He was right, but he didn't tell me I'd also see things I'd never want to forget. The way the old man held his wife's hand while she coded, the way she said, "Thank you," even though he was gone. That's the part nobody warns you about, the gratitude. The way people look at you like you're a miracle, even though you're just a guy who showed up. June 7th, 1991. Lost a baby today. SIDS. The mother handed her to me like I could fix it, like I was God. I held that baby for 45 minutes after she was gone. I didn't know what else to do. I sat on the floor of their living room and I held her, and I rocked her, and I sang the same lullaby my mother sang to me. The mother heard me through the wall. She came out of the bedroom and she sat beside me and we held that baby together. I don't believe in heaven. But if I did, I'd want that baby to know she was loved at the end. September 22nd, 1994. Norah told me she wants to be a paramedic. I pretended to be surprised. I pretended to have doubt. But the truth is, I've known since she was 8 years old, and she found a baby bird that had fallen out of its nest, and she carried it around in her pocket for 3 days, feeding it with an eyedropper, talking to it in a voice so soft I had to lean close to hear. That bird died. She buried it in the backyard and made a cross out of popsicle sticks, and she didn't cry until after dinner. She waited until she was alone. That's the thing about her. She feels everything. She just doesn't want anyone to see. January 4th, 1998. Lost a man on the highway tonight. Drunk driver, head-on collision. The other driver walked away with a scratch. The man I was called to save died on the way to the hospital. I sat with his wife in the waiting room afterward. She asked me if he had suffered. I told her no. I don't know if that was true, but it was the only thing I could give her. Sometimes the only thing you can give someone is a lie that sounds like mercy. May 19th, 2002, Norah's crash. They called me from the hospital. I drove 90 miles an hour with my lights on, same as always, same as 1,000 times before, but this time it was different. This time it was my daughter. I walked into that trauma bay, and she was on the table, and she was so small, so still. I forgot everything I knew. I forgot how to be a paramedic. I just stood there and held her hand and begged her to wake up. She woke up. But she wasn't the same. Neither was I. December 11th, 2002, Norah left for Oregon today. She didn't say goodbye. She left a note on the kitchen table. I need to go somewhere I don't have to be strong. I sat in the driveway for 2 hours after she left. I sat in the ambulance. I turned the key in the ignition, and I listened to the engine idle, and I thought about every call I'd ever run, every patient I'd ever lost, every moment I'd ever spent trying to save someone who couldn't be saved. And I thought, maybe I should have tried harder to save her. Maybe I should have seen it coming. Maybe I should have been a better father instead of a better paramedic. March 3rd, 2005. I found the building today, on Greer Street, the one with the sign in the window that says clinic, even though it's never been one. The landlord is an old man named Frank who smokes cigarettes that smell like burnt chocolate. He asked me what I wanted to do with the space. I told him I didn't know yet. He said, "Take your time. This building's been waiting for someone for 20 years. It can wait a little longer." I walked through the rooms, the exam rooms, the waiting room, the little office in the back with the window that looks out on the alley, and I thought, this is where I could do it. This is where I could build the thing I've been thinking about for 10 years, a place for the people who fall through the cracks, the ones with no insurance, no money, no one to call. The ones who show up at the ER with a cough they've had for 6 months and a fear in their eyes that says they already know the answer, but they can't afford to hear it. August 17th, 2007. I don't know how to tell Norah about the building. I don't know how to tell her that I'm not just a retired paramedic sitting in a driveway. I don't know how to tell her that I've been seeing patients in the Greer Street Clinic for 2 years now, not full-time, not the way I used to. Just 1 or 2 a week. The ones who can't go anywhere else, the ones who find me through word of mouth, through the network of people I've helped over the years, through the letters they write that I keep in the boxes under the floor. I don't charge them. I can't. That's not why I do it. I do it because I don't know how to stop. I do it because every time I try to sit still, I hear the sirens in my head. I do it because this is the only way I know how to be alive. January 12th, 2010. Maria came to the clinic today. She's 23. She has a cough that won't go away and a baby at home and no health insurance and a husband who works 2 jobs and still can't make the rent. I listened to her lungs. I heard the crackle. The sound I've heard 1,000 times. The sound that means something is wrong. I sent her to the hospital for imaging. I paid for it myself. I told her it was a grant. I told her there was a fund for people in her situation. I lied, but I don't care. She's 23. She has a baby. She deserves to live. June 4th, 2013. The clinic has a waiting list now. 53 people. 53 people who need a doctor and can't afford one. I see as many as I can. 3 a day, 4 if I push myself. My hands hurt at night. My back hurts all the time, but I can't stop. These people have no one else. They come to me with their pain and their fear and their hope, and I give them what I can. Antibiotics, blood pressure medication, the names of specialists who will see them for free if I call in a favor. I give them the truth, even when it's hard, especially when it's hard. And I give them something else. I give them my time. I sit with them. I listen. I tell them they matter. Because they do. Because someone should. September 29th, 2015. Norah called today. First time in 3 months. She sounds tired. She sounds like she's still running from something. I wanted to tell her about the clinic. I wanted to tell her that I've built something here, something that matters, something that could be hers someday if she wanted it. But I couldn't find the words. I never can. So I asked her about the weather in Oregon instead. She said it was foggy. She said it was always foggy. She said she liked it that way. I told her I missed her. She didn't say it back, but I heard it. In the silence. In the way she breathed. In the way she stayed on the phone for 30 seconds after the conversation was over, neither of us speaking, both of us just listening to the distance between us. The journal went on for 200 pages. Norah read until the light through the back doors turned from gray to gold to deep purple to black. She read by the light of her phone, the screen glowing in the darkness, casting shadows that moved across the walls of the ambulance like the ghosts of all the people her father had saved. She read about the clinic on Greer Street. She read about the patients. Maria with the cough, James with the diabetes he couldn't afford to treat, Eleanor with the arthritis that made it impossible to button her coat, Tommy with the seizures that came without warning and left him confused and ashamed. She read their names, their stories, the small, ordinary details of their lives, the jobs they worked, the children they raised, the fears they carried, the hope they clung to even when everything seemed hopeless. She read about her father's hands, how they ached at night, how he soaked them in warm water every morning before he saw his first patient, just to loosen the joints enough to write a prescription. How he kept going even when the pain was bad, even when he couldn't hold a pen without shaking, because the people on his waiting list had nowhere else to go. She read about the money, the inheritance he'd never told anyone about, the small sum from his own father's estate, the one he'd been supposed to split with his sister before she died. He had put it all into the clinic, into the building, into the equipment, into the medication he gave away for free. He had kept it a secret because he didn't want anyone to think he was a hero. He didn't want anyone to know. He just wanted to help. And then, on the last page of the journal, in handwriting that was shakier than the rest, the handwriting of a man who knew he was running out of time, she found this. February 18th, 2016. I'm going to die soon. I can feel it. The cancer is in my liver now, probably other places too. I haven't told Norah. I haven't told anyone. There's no point. Knowing won't change anything. It will just make them sad, and I've spent my whole life trying to make people less sad. But I need to write this down. I need to say it somewhere. The clinic on Greer Street is the most important thing I've ever done. More important than any call. More important than any patient. Because the clinic isn't just about saving lives. It's about reminding people that they matter, that someone sees them, that someone cares whether they live or die. I can't let it end with me. There has to be someone who keeps it going. Someone who understands that this work isn't about glory or recognition or any of the things the world tells us to chase. It's about showing up, day after day, for people who have no one else. I thought once that Norah might be that person. I thought she might come back. I thought she might find her way to this work the same way I did. But I don't know anymore. She's so far away. Not just the miles, the distance inside her, the part of her that closed up after the crash. I don't know how to reach that part. I don't know if anyone can. But I have to believe that someday she'll find these letters. Someday she'll open the compartment and read the words of all the people who needed help and found it. And maybe, just maybe, she'll remember who she used to be. The girl who carried a baby bird in her pocket. The girl who talked a 6-year-old boy back from the edge of death. The girl who was braver than she knew. Maybe she'll remember that there's still a paramedic inside her. Maybe she'll come home. Norah closed the journal. The ambulance was completely dark now. The only light was the glow of her phone screen, reflected in the glass of the heart monitor mounted near the ceiling. The monitor was dark, had been dark for 11 years, but she could almost see her father's face in the glass, the way he used to look at her, the way he used to say her name. She sat in the darkness for a long time, and then she got up. Her knees protested, her back complained. Her left hand, the one that had been numb since the crash, tingled with a sensation she couldn't name. She climbed out of the ambulance and stood in the gravel lot, breathing the cold March air, looking up at the stars. The key was still in her hand. She had forgotten she was holding it. The clinic on Greer Street was 5 blocks from her father's house. She drove past it 3 times before she found the nerve to park. The building was smaller than she'd imagined. A single story, painted white sometime in the 1970s, the paint now peeling in long curls that looked like old parchment. The sign in the window said, "Clinic," in block letters that had been hand-painted by someone with a steady hand and an eye for symmetry. Her father's hand. She recognized the way he made his teas. The front door was unlocked. That surprised her. Not because she expected it to be locked. Her father had never been the kind of man who locked things, who believed that locks could keep out the things he was afraid of, but because the building had been empty for nearly a year. Since his diagnosis. Since he'd stopped coming. She pushed the door open. The smell hit her first. Not decay or neglect. Something else. The smell of old paper and antiseptic, and the particular mustiness that comes from a space that has been closed up for too long. The smell of waiting. The waiting room was small. 6 chairs, arranged in 2 rows of 3, the kind of chairs you'd find in a doctor's office from the 1980s, upholstered in that rough fabric that feels like it was designed to be impossible to stain. A coffee table in the center, stacked with magazines from 2015, a reception desk near the back wall, the kind with a sliding glass window that had probably seemed modern once. On the desk was a stack of index cards. Norah picked one up. The handwriting was her father's. Maria, 23, cough for 6 months. Sent to St. Mary's for imaging. Follow-up March 15th. Another card. James, 58, diabetes, needs testing supplies. Called the free clinic in Lansing. They'll help. Another. Eleanor, 72, arthritis, referred to Dr. Patel for possible joint replacement, insurance pending. Card after card, patient after patient. Her father's careful handwriting, recording the details of lives that had crossed his path, people who had walked through this door and sat in these chairs and trusted him with their pain. Norah walked through the door behind the reception desk. The hallway was narrow. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, humming in a frequency that vibrated in her teeth. 3 doors, one on the left, one on the right, one at the end of the hall. She opened the door on the left. An exam room. Small, barely large enough for the table in the center and the counter along the wall. The table was covered in paper that had yellowed with age. The counter held a blood pressure cuff, a stethoscope, a box of latex gloves that had expired in 2014. A window looked out on the alley behind the building, the glass streaked with the residue of 1,000 rainstorms. She opened the door on the right. Another exam room. Almost identical to the first, except for the photograph taped to the wall. A photograph of a woman, middle-aged, smiling, standing in front of the same building, the same sign in the window, her arm around a man Norah recognized as her father. The photograph was dated June 2015. The woman's name was written on the back in her father's handwriting. Maria, cancer-free, 5 years. Norah stood in the exam room and looked at the photograph and felt something crack open inside her chest. Something she had kept locked up for 11 years, something she had told herself was gone, was dead, was never coming back. The door at the end of the hall was closed. She opened it. The office was small, smaller than the exam rooms. A desk, a chair, a filing cabinet, a window that looked out on the alley. The desk was covered in papers, referral forms, prescription pads, notes about patients, notes about medications, notes about phone calls she would never know the content of. And on the desk, in the center, placed there like an offering, was a photograph in a cheap plastic frame. Norah picked it up. The photograph was old. The colors had faded to something soft and dreamlike, the edges curled and worn. It showed 2 people standing in front of an ambulance, a man and a woman. The man was her father, younger, his hair still dark, his face unlined. The woman was her, 23 years old, her arm around his waist, his arm around her shoulders, both of them smiling, both of them wearing the same uniform, both of them looking at the camera like they had no idea that everything was about to change. She had forgotten this photograph existed. She had forgotten that she had ever been that person, the person who smiled, the person who belonged, the person who stood beside her father and felt, for one brief moment, like she was exactly where she was supposed to be. She sat down in her father's chair. The seat was worn. softened by years of use, by the weight of a man who had spent countless hours sitting here, writing notes, making calls, worrying about people whose names she would never know. She could feel him in the fabric, in the shape of the cushion, in the slight lean to the left, the way the chair tilted toward the desk because he always sat with his weight on one side. The filing cabinet was locked. She tried the key. It fit. She opened the top drawer. The files were organized alphabetically. Patient names, hundreds of them. Each file contained the same thing: a patient intake form, a record of visits, a list of medications prescribed, and a handwritten note from her father. Sometimes just a sentence, sometimes a paragraph. Always personal, always specific, always a reminder that this person was more than a diagnosis, more than a case number, more than a body that needed fixing. Angela, 34, 2 kids, works the night shift at the truck stop. Her blood pressure is dangerous. I told her she needs to take time off. She laughed. She can't afford to take time off. I gave her samples, enough for 3 months. I'll figure out the rest. Robert, 67, lives alone. His daughter calls every Sunday. He pretends everything is fine. He's not fine. His COPD is getting worse. He can't afford the oxygen he needs. I'm calling in a favor at the respiratory therapy department. They owe me. Tammy, 41, breast cancer, diagnosed at the free clinic in Flint. She came to me because she couldn't afford the follow-up care. I made some calls, found an oncologist who will see her pro bono. She cried in my office for 20 minutes. I cried too. I didn't let her see. File after file, patient after patient. Her father had seen thousands of them, had treated them in this building, in these rooms, with equipment that was decades old and supplies that were held together with duct tape and determination. He had done it without fanfare, without recognition, without anyone knowing except the people he helped. Norah closed the filing cabinet. She sat in her father's chair and looked out the window at the alley and the wall of the building next door, a brick wall covered in graffiti that had been there so long it had become part of the landscape. A single streetlight cast a pool of orange light on the pavement. The light flickered just slightly, the way old streetlights do when they're about to burn out. Her phone buzzed. She looked at the screen. Marcus. She let it ring. It stopped, started again, stopped, started again. On the 4th ring, she answered. Did you find anything in the ambulance? No hello, no how are you, no acknowledgement of the fact that their father had been dead for less than 2 weeks, and Norah was sitting in a building she hadn't known existed until 4 hours ago. Marcus had always been like this, direct, efficient, transactional. He had learned it from their mother, the woman who had left when Norah was 12, who had moved to Florida and remarried and started a new family and sent Christmas cards for a few years before even that became too much effort. Their mother had been transactional too. She had taught Marcus that love was a series of exchanges, that affection was currency, that the only thing that mattered was what you could get. Their father had been the opposite. Their father had given everything away. His time, his energy, his money, his health. He had poured himself out for people who could never repay him, and he had done it gladly, willingly, with the quiet joy of a man who had figured out the secret that most people spend their whole lives searching for. The ambulance is scrap, Norah said, like the appraiser said. There's nothing inside, no equipment we could sell, no supplies. It's been parked for 11 years, Marcus. Everything inside is expired or broken. A pause. She could hear him calculating. Could almost see the numbers moving behind his eyes, the way they always had, even when they were kids and he was trading baseball cards with the neighbor boy, always coming out ahead, always walking away with more than he started with. What about the building on Greer Street? The question hung in the air. Norah's hand tightened on the phone. Her father's chair creaked beneath her. The fluorescent light in the hallway buzzed, a sound that seemed to grow louder in the silence, filling the office with its insistent hum. I don't know what you're talking about, she said. The building Dad owned, the one he used as some kind of free clinic. I found the deed in his safe deposit box. He bought it in 2005, paid cash. Never told anyone. Marcus's voice was careful, measured, the voice of a man who was trying to decide how much to reveal, how much to keep hidden, how to play this game that he saw as a game, even though nothing about it was a game at all. I didn't know about it either, Norah said. Not until today. What's inside? What do you mean? Equipment, supplies, anything valuable. The building itself might be worth something if we fix it up. The neighborhood's coming back. There's a coffee shop opening 2 blocks away. Real estate agent said we could get Marcus. She hadn't meant to interrupt, hadn't meant to use that tone, the tone she hadn't used in 11 years, the tone that belonged to the person she used to be, the paramedic who walked into chaos and found calm, who looked at the worst moments of people's lives and didn't flinch. But it came out anyway, sharp, clear, certain. There's nothing here for you. What do you mean there's nothing here for me? I'm his son. I have just as much right to... Listen to me. She stood up. The chair rolled back and hit the wall with a soft thud. Dad bought this building with money from Grandpa's estate. The money was supposed to be split between him and Aunt Carol, but she died before she could take her share. He used it all, every cent. He turned it into a clinic for people who couldn't afford health care. He saw thousands of patients here. He gave away thousands of dollars in medication. He never charged a single person. Do you understand? This building isn't an asset. It's a gift, and I'm not going to let you turn it into a coffee shop. The silence on the other end of the line was heavy, charged, the silence of a man who had been told no for the first time in a very long time. You don't get to decide that alone, Marcus said finally. I have a lawyer. You can keep the savings account. Nora's voice was calm now, almost gentle. The voice she used with patients who were scared, who needed to hear that everything was going to be okay even when she wasn't sure it was. You can keep the tools. You can keep the truck. You can sell the house and take your half and do whatever you want with it. But the building on Greer Street stays, and the ambulance stays. Those are mine. They're not yours. They're Dad's, and he wanted them to go to someone who would use them the way he used them, someone who would keep helping the people he helped, someone who would carry on what he started. And you think that someone is you? The question hit her like a physical thing, like a punch to the chest, like the moment after the crash, when she opened her eyes and realized she couldn't feel her left hand, couldn't move her legs, couldn't do any of the things she had built her entire identity around being able to do. She thought about her father's journal, about the words he had written in shaky handwriting, knowing he was dying, hoping she would find them. Maybe she'll remember who she used to be. The girl who carried a baby bird in her pocket. The girl who talked a 6-year-old boy back from the edge of death. The girl who was braver than she knew. She thought about the photograph on the desk, the two of them in their uniforms standing in front of the ambulance, smiling like they had no idea that everything was about to change. She thought about the letters in the compartment, thousands of them, thousands of people who had written to her father to say thank you, to say they were still here, to say that his voice had been a rope and they had held on. I don't know, she said, but I'm going to find out. She hung up before Marcus could respond. The next morning, Norah drove to the address listed in her father's journal. It was a church, small, white-clapboard with a steeple that leaned slightly to the left, as if the building had been standing for so long it had earned the right to be crooked. The sign out front said, St. Mark's Community Church, in letters that had been repainted recently, the white bright against the weathered wood. The door was unlocked. Inside, the church was smaller than it looked from the outside. A dozen pews arranged in 2 rows, a pulpit at the front, draped in a cloth that had been hand-embroidered with flowers and vines. Stained glass windows on either side, depicting scenes Norah didn't recognize. Not the usual Bible stories, but images of people helping people. A woman bandaging a man's arm, a child being lifted from a well, an old man handing bread to a younger one. A woman stood at the front of the church, arranging flowers in a vase. She was older, 70 maybe, with gray hair pulled back in a bun and hands that were knotted with arthritis but still steady. She turned when Norah entered, and her face shifted through several expressions before settling on something that looked like recognition. "You're Tom's girl," the woman said. Not a question. Norah nodded. "Norah." "I know who you are. Your father talked about you all the time." The woman set down the flowers and walked toward her, wiping her hands on her apron. "I'm Ruth. I run the food pantry here. Your father and I worked together for years." "Worked together?" Ruth smiled. It was a sad smile, the kind of smile that comes from someone who has seen too much and kept going anyway. "He didn't tell you?" "He didn't tell me a lot of things." "No, he wouldn't have. That wasn't his way." Ruth gestured to the pews. "Sit. I'll make tea, and I'll tell you about the man you thought you knew." The tea was strong and sweet, the way her father used to drink it. Norah sat in a pew near the front, the wood smooth beneath her, worn down by decades of people sitting in the same spots, seeking the same comfort. Ruth sat beside her close enough that their shoulders almost touched. "Your father started coming here about 12 years ago," Ruth said. "He showed up one Tuesday afternoon and asked if we had anyone who needed medical care. I told him we had plenty, people who couldn't afford a doctor, people who hadn't seen one in years, people who were sick and scared and didn't know where to turn. He said, 'Send them to me. I'll see them for free, I'll see them for as long as they need.'" At the clinic on Greer Street. That's right, he built that place himself, did most of the work with his own hands. Wouldn't let anyone help, said it was his gift to give, his way of making up for... Ruth stopped, hesitated. He never told me what he was making up for. Norah looked down at her hands. The left one was numb again, the way it always was when she was tired or stressed or thinking about things she'd rather not think about. She flexed her fingers, watched them move, felt the strange disconnect between what she saw and what she felt. "He thought he failed me," she said quietly. "After the crash. He thought he should have been able to protect me, to fix me, to make me whole again." "He told you that?" "He didn't have to. I could see it. In the way he looked at me, in the way he held back, like he was afraid of breaking something that was already broken." Ruth was quiet for a moment. The church was still. The only sound was the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen, the distant rumble of a truck on the street outside. "He never stopped talking about you," Ruth said finally. "Every time I saw him, he'd ask if I'd heard from you, if you were okay, if you were happy. I'd tell him I didn't know because I didn't, because you never called me either. But he kept asking, week after week, month after month. He kept hoping you'd come back." "I didn't know." "I know you didn't. That's the tragedy of it. He loved you so much, and he couldn't find the words to tell you, and you couldn't find the way to hear him. Two people who loved each other more than anything, and neither one of you knew how to say it." Nora's throat tightened. She blinked. The stained glass windows blurred and sharpened, the colors bleeding together like watercolors in the rain. "Did he ever talk about the people he helped?" she asked. "The patients?" "He didn't have to talk about them. I saw them. Week after week, they'd come to the food pantry and they'd tell me about the doctor on Greer Street who saw them for free, who gave them medication, who sat with them and listened and made them feel like they mattered. They'd come in here and they'd cry sometimes. Not because they were sad, because they couldn't believe someone like him existed. Someone who didn't want anything in return, someone who just wanted to help." Ruth reached into the pocket of her apron and pulled out a small notebook. It was worn, the cover soft with use, the pages filled with handwriting that was not her father's. "I kept a list," Ruth said, "of all the people he helped, their names, their stories, what he did for them. I started it about 5 years ago when I realized that no one else was keeping track, that no one would ever know how many lives he touched unless someone wrote it down." She handed the notebook to Norah. The pages were filled with names, hundreds of them, each one accompanied by a few sentences in Ruth's careful, looping handwriting. Norah flipped through the pages, reading names, reading stories, reading the small, ordinary details of lives that had been changed by a man who refused to let anyone know what he was doing. Sarah M., 45, single mother of 3, had a lump in her breast for 2 years but couldn't afford a mammogram. Dr. Tom arranged for a free screening at St. Mary's. It was benign. She cried in his office for an hour. He held her hand and told her she was going to watch her children grow up. David K., 62, veteran, homeless, lived in his car for 3 years. Dr. Tom treated his diabetes, his high blood pressure, his depression, never charged him a cent, found him housing through a VA program David didn't know existed. David comes to the food pantry every week now. He always asks if Dr. Tom is coming back. Linda R., 38, factory worker, had a stroke at work, no insurance. Dr. Tom drove her to the hospital himself, stayed with her for 8 hours, made sure she got the care she needed. She's in a rehab facility now, learning to walk again. She told me last week that she's going to name her next child after him, even if it's a girl. Page after page, name after name. Her father had touched so many lives, had helped so many people, had poured himself out in ways that no one would ever fully know. And now he was gone. And the clinic on Greer Street was empty. and the ambulance in the gravel lot was worth $400 in scrap metal, and somewhere, buried deep inside Norah's chest, something that had been sleeping for 11 years was beginning to stir. She went back to the clinic that afternoon. She walked through every room, touched every surface, sat in every chair. She opened the cabinets in the exam rooms and found supplies, bandages, gauze, antiseptic wipes, tongue depressors, all of it old, most of it expired, but some of it still usable. She opened the drawers in the reception desk and found intake forms, blank and ready, waiting for names to be written on them. She found a calendar on the wall behind the desk. The pages still turned to October 2015, the last month her father had been able to work full days before the cancer took too much of his energy. She found a photograph tucked into the corner of the calendar, a photograph of her, taken in Oregon, on the beach, the fog behind her so thick it swallowed the horizon. She was smiling in the photograph. She couldn't remember what had made her smile, couldn't remember who had taken the picture, but her father had found it somehow, had printed it out, had taped it to his calendar so he could see her face every day. She sat behind the reception desk and looked at the photograph and felt the thing in her chest stir again. Louder this time, more insistent. She thought about the letters in the compartment, about the thousands of people who had written to her father to say thank you, about the people who were still out there, the ones on his waiting list, the ones who had no one else to call. She thought about her father's journal, about the words he had written in shaky handwriting. I have to believe that someday she'll find these letters, that she'll remember who she used to be. She thought about the photograph on the desk, the two of them in their uniforms, standing in front of the ambulance, smiling like they had no idea that everything was about to change. And she thought about what Ruth had said. Two people who loved each other more than anything, and neither one of you knew how to say it. Norah picked up her phone. She scrolled through her contacts until she found the number she hadn't called in 11 years. The number of the paramedic who had trained her, who had worked beside her, who had held her while she cried after her first code and told her that the pain would never go away, but that she would learn to carry it. The number of the person who might still know someone who knew someone who could help her figure out what to do next. She pressed call. The line rang once, twice, 3 times. Hello? It's Norah. I need your help. A pause, a sharp intake of breath. Then, I thought you'd never ask. The next morning, Norah drove to the hospital where she used to work. She hadn't been inside in 11 years. The building had changed. New signage, new entrance, new automatic doors that slid open with a soft hiss instead of the heavy pull of the old ones. But the smell was the same. The smell of antiseptic and fear and hope and the strange, indescribable thing that hospitals always smelled like. The smell of people trying to live. She walked through the lobby, past the gift shop, past the information desk, past the elevator banks and the signs pointing to the cafeteria and the chapel and the administrative offices. She walked until she found the door she was looking for, the door that led to the emergency department. She pushed it open. The emergency department was busier than she remembered. More beds, more monitors, more staff moving quickly, efficiently, with the focused urgency of people who knew that seconds mattered. She stood at the edge of the chaos and watched. And for a moment she was 23 again, wearing a uniform, walking into the same chaos with her hands steady and her voice calm. Norah? She turned. The man standing behind her was older than she remembered, grayer, thinner, but his eyes were the same, sharp, observant, the eyes of someone who had seen too much and somehow kept going. His name was Dave. He had been her partner for 3 years. He had been the one to find her after the crash, to sit with her in the hospital room, to tell her that she was going to be okay, even though neither of them believed it. Dave? He hugged her. Not the careful, tentative hug of someone who didn't know what to do. The real hug of someone who had missed her, who had worried about her, who had never stopped hoping she would come back. I heard about your dad, he said when he pulled away. I'm sorry. He was a good man. One of the best. He was. What are you doing here? Not that I'm not glad to see you, I need to ask you something. Norah took a breath. The thing in her chest was stirring again, louder now, almost painful. My father had a clinic on Greer Street. He saw patients there for free, people who couldn't afford health care anywhere else. Dave nodded. I know. He sent some of them to me, people who needed follow-up care. specialists, things he couldn't provide at the clinic. I saw them whenever I could, pro bono, the way he did. He never told me. He wouldn't have. That wasn't his style. No, it wasn't. Norah looked around the emergency department, at the beds, at the monitors, at the staff moving between them, doing the work her father had done for 32 years, the work she had done for 6 years before the crash took it away from her. I want to reopen the clinic. I want to keep seeing the patients on his waiting list, but I don't know where to start. I don't know if I can still do this work. I don't know if I'm still... Stop! Dave's voice was gentle but firm. The voice he used with patients who were spiraling, who needed someone to anchor them before they drifted too far. You're asking the wrong questions, he said. You're asking if you're still capable of doing the work. Of course you are. You were one of the best paramedics I've ever worked with, and that hasn't changed just because you've been gone for 11 years. The question you should be asking is whether you want to do the work, whether you're ready to come back to a job that broke you once, whether you're willing to risk being broken again. Norah was quiet for a long time. The emergency department hummed around her. Monitors beeped. Voices called out. A stretcher rolled past, a patient on board, a paramedic walking beside it, talking in a low, steady voice that sounded familiar and strange all at once. I don't know if I'm ready, she said finally, but I don't know how to keep running anymore. Dave put his hand on her shoulder, squeezed, the way he used to before everything, when they were partners and friends and the only two people in the world who understood what it was like to walk into the worst moments of people's lives and try to make them better. Then stop running, he said. Start there and see what happens. She went back to the clinic. She spent the rest of the week cleaning. She scrubbed the floors, wiped down the walls, organized the supplies, threw away the things that were too old to use, and made a list of the things she would need to replace. She called the utility companies and had the electricity and water turned back on. She called the landlord, the old man named Frank, who still smoked cigarettes that smelled like burnt chocolate, and told him she was taking over the lease. Frank had been quiet on the phone, thoughtful. Then, "Your father was a good man. He helped me with my back when I couldn't afford a doctor, never asked for a thing in return. I'm glad you're keeping the place open." He didn't ask about rent, didn't ask about money, just said, "It's paid up through the end of the year. Your father took care of it before he got sick. We'll figure out the rest later." Norah hung up and sat in her father's chair and looked at the photograph on the desk. The two of them in their uniforms, smiling, unaware. She opened the bottom drawer of the desk and found a stack of paper, blank, clean, waiting. She took out a pen. She wrote, "Clinic on Greer Street, reopening, free medical care for those who cannot afford it. Walk-ins welcome, by appointment for follow-ups. Hours, Tuesdays and Thursdays, 9 a.m. to 5 p.m., starting April 1st. She looked at the words she had written. Her handwriting was shakier than her father's, less certain, but it was hers. It was the handwriting of someone who was trying, who was showing up, who was doing the next right thing even though she was terrified. She taped the sign to the inside of the front window. Then she walked outside and stood on the sidewalk and looked at the building. At the sign in the window, at the peeling paint and the crooked door and the window that had been cracked for years and never fixed. It was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. The first patient came on a Tuesday. Her name was Delia. She was 68 years old. She had a cough that had lasted for 3 months and a pain in her chest that came and went without warning. She had no health insurance, no primary care doctor, no one to call except the number her neighbor had given her, the number for the clinic on Greer Street, the one run by the daughter of the man who used to help everyone for free. Norah sat with Delia in the exam room, the room with the photograph of Maria on the wall, the woman who had been cancer-free for 5 years because Norah's father had refused to let her slip through the cracks. She listened to Delia's lungs, felt the crackle. The sound she had heard 1,000 times, the sound that meant something was wrong. And then she did what her father had taught her to do. She looked at Delia, really looked at her, and she said, "We're going to figure this out together. You're not alone anymore." Delia cried. Norah held her hand. The thing in Norah's chest, the thing that had been sleeping for 11 years, the thing she had thought was dead, the thing she had buried under 8 years of Oregon fog and bookstore shelves, and the slow, quiet death of hope. That thing opened its eyes, and it began to breathe.